So we've talked about how semantic memory works in terms of cortical columns and areas. But let's go a little deeper and think about how the necessary indirect activations can be implemented by the brain. A simplistic model would be if connectivity was established directly from the auditory columns to the visual columns, increasing in weight with each simultaneous activity. But that would require a lot of connectivity, and a major issue also would be that indirect activations can't be allowed to occur without some limitations. They must be behaviors that can be recommended by receptive field detections, but only accepted or rejected by the basal ganglia. If there are direct connections, the management of these behaviors could be a bit more difficult. A more effective architecture is to have an intermediate area located in connectivity terms between auditory and visual areas. Columns in the intermediate area have receptive fields that are defined by groups of auditory columns often active at the same time in the past. Many such receptive fields will be defined, and of course, one auditory receptive field could be part of many intermediate fields. Each intermediate field targets visual columns that have often been active in the past when it was also active. Again, different intermediate fields may target partially overlapping groups of visual columns. Those could be typical examples there. The same column is targeted by two different intermediate columns. The management of indirect activation strengths then occurs in two stages. The receptive field detections in the auditory area recommend indirect activation behaviors, which, if supported by recommendation strengths from other cortical areas, indicating that the more general circumstances are appropriate for such behaviors, are accepted by the basal ganglia and implemented by the thalamus. And that implementation results in release of the auditory receptive field detections to the intermediate area. And remember, that release is implemented by placing a frequency modulation on the outputs from the auditory area to the intermediate area. Some receptive fields are detected in the intermediate area, corresponding with groups of auditory columns that are currently active and have also often been active at the same time in the past. These active receptive fields recommend release of their outputs to the visual area. If that recommendation is supported by inputs from other cortical areas, again corresponding with circumstances in which such a release is appropriate, the behavior will be accepted by the basal ganglia. And again, the thalamus is triggered to release a specific subset of the intermediate receptive fields to drive indirect activations in the visual area. And these indirectly activated visual columns can then recommend various behaviors, such as describing the visual appearance of the object corresponding with the word. So, where in the brain are these intermediate areas that include receptive fields corresponding with groups of auditory columns that have often been active at the same time? Well, this is an MRI coronal section of a normal brain. Many types of brain damage can affect semantic memory to a degree, but often affect one type, but not another. One example is memory for animals and memory for inanimate objects. Typically, animals and objects have very different behavioral implications, and as a result, the behavioral advantages of separate areas outweighs the resource cost. Because of this, it's possible for damage to one area to affect memory for animals and not for objects, and vice versa. However, there's a deficit known as semantic dementia, in which all types of semantic memory are degraded. In a normal brain, this is a cortical region called the left inferior temporal gyrus. On the right is the comparable MRI for such a patient, and you can see that the left inferior frontal gyrus has degraded. It's interesting that when a semantic memory is being retrieved, There's usually less activity in this area than in a number of other areas, because the retrieved information, say the pseudo-visual information, is not located here. This area just provides, if you like, the pointers between related information that's mostly stored elsewhere in the cortex.